Hello, this is Jove Aguas once again, and welcome to my lectures in Theories on Reality. And for this lecture, I will be focusing on the metaphysics of the Pre-Socratic philosophers. We know that the Pre-Socratics are considered to be the first philosophers in Western philosophy because they were the first to have asked a philosophical question, or they were the first to engage in philosophical reflection. And their philosophical reflection or investigation was centered on the question about the cosmos, about the basic world stuff. They have observed that in the cosmos or in the physical world, there are changes, things are in flux, uh, things transform, but at the same time, there is something that remains the same. There is some degree of permanence or stability. So the question of the Pre-Socratic is, what is the basic world stuff, or what is the basic principle that underlies the changes and at the same time the permanence or stability in the cosmos or in nature? So that's the basic question that they ask, and from this basic question, of course, they inquired, they searched for answer, and thus uh, started the philosophical enterprise or philosophical investigation or philosophy itself, at least from the Western tradition. So the first of these pre-Socratic philosophers are the Ionians. The Ionians were concerned, as in the case of the other philosophers, with the external or physical reality or nature. So they inquired about what accounts for the change and for the stability or the unity that underneath the multiplicity of the physical world. And the first of these philosophers is Thales. So, of course, we consider Thales to be the first of these philosophers. And the concern of Thales is to find the unity that underlies all the multiplicity of things in our experience. That is the problem of the one and the many. So the question is, what unifies all the diverse things in the world? And what is the basic principle that account for this? And of course, Thales' answer, according to the account of Aristotle, is that unifying principle is water. Water is the original, what the primary stuff. Now, of course, such answer may seem to be too naive, but it is original because if you're going to compare it, or if you're going to understand it today, because of course water cannot be the underlying principle of all things, but during the time of Thales, where philosophical or logical discussion is not yet really practiced, that is something original. And Aristotle speculates that Thales probably have reasoned from the fact that water is essential to life, and the seeds of all things are moist, and therefore water is the fundamental element of reality that underlies all this multiplicity, all this diversity, all these changes in the physical world. Another reason could be that everything is transformed into water, like, for example, gas, ice, mist, they all go through kind of transformation in the basis of being a liquid, water in that case. So Thales' significance lies in the fact that that he was the first to offer a rational or logical account of reality, which is very much different from the mythological account of the poets. Like, for example, the accounts of Homer and Hesiod. So his position could be described as metaphysical monism because he claimed that there is only one principle that account for the changes, uh, the multiplicity and the unity of things in the world. But At the same time, we can say that it is a physical monism because he identified this principle as something that is physical, something that is material. So water is a material or physical substance. So it's a kind of a kind of a physical monism. Now the next philosopher is Anaximander, and Anaximander, just like Thales, asked the same question: What is the basic, or what is a single basic stuff that is fundamental to all things? And although he assumed, like his predecessor, that there's only one principle, so it is also a kind of monism, but he disagreed with him as to the answer. Water is like any other particular things in the physical world, like air, fire, earth, and therefore it cannot be just water because it shares with some of the physical objects in the cosmos. So, for Anaximander, whatever is fundamental and universal cannot have a particular property like water has. Water itself needs to be explained, according to Anaximander. So, with that questioning, he started the process of philosophical criticism because he critiqued the position of the previous position or the position of the philosopher uh, prior to him. Now, according to Anaximander, the ultimate reality must be something that is eternal, imperishable, the source from which all things would come and then return. And this ultimate reality, according to Anaximander, is the apeiron, or the boundless, or the infinite. So it is without any internal boundaries or division, and it is space filling dynamic mass. It is infinite in time and indefinite in quantity. So that is the boundless or the apeiron. The apeiron contains or produces uh, now the apeiron contains or produces all specific properties. Therefore, it cannot be identified with any qualities or physical properties of things. Therefore, it is undefinable. Okay, and Anaximander, with this, developed a theory of change. According to him, the world is made up of warring opposites, like, for example, cold, heat, night, day, etc. And since they are opposites, one cannot cause the other. However, they must all come from something else that is more fundamental. So, change is the process of the various qualities separating out from and returning to the primordial substance. Now, this reminds us of our discussion of the yin and yang in Chinese philosophy or in Taoism, okay, in particular. So, but of course, the difference is that for Anaximander, these are totally opposites. These are warring opposites. But in Chinese philosophy, the yin and the yang are not really totally opposite. They are relative opposites. So there's the difference between this Greek conception and the uh, Chinese conception. So originally, all things were part of the mass of the boundless of the apeiron, and in the act of creation, the different qualities were flung out from it, like particles being separated out from the solution in a centrifuge. And through this process, all the warring opposites like heat and cold, dark and bright, etc., uh, were produced. So the combinations of these qualities produce the objects in our experience. Anaximander's significance therefore lies in the fact that his theory moved towards a more abstract mode of thought, of course, as compared to the, the philosophy of Thales. The boundless is itself abstract, and it freed the mind from the physical and to think about what that which transcends daily experiences. So uh, he contributed to the philosophical progress by building on his predecessor's theory, but improving it in the process. So he developed a kind of philosophical critique, but at the same time, he also uh, contributed to the progress of philosophical speculation. Now, the second philosopher is Anaximenes. Anaximenes is concerned with the same question as his fellow Milesians, and Anaximenes agreed with Anaximander that the basic reality must be eternal, unlimited, and singular. But he finds Anaximander's answer to be inadequate. To say that the ultimate reality is the boundless or the apeiron is not to say much at all. If there is a basic substance, we must be able to say something about it. Okay? We must be able to say something about it. And if we know that it is there at all, we must be able to know it and say something about it. So, using the criterion of clarity, he embarked on the task of finding a less vague and more fundamental and more convincing answer to the fundamental problem. Okay? So the answer of Anaximenes to that question is air. Air is the basic world stuff. Now, with this answer, he returned to physical substance as the basic element, similar to Thales. Air is more pervasive than water. It is central to all nature. It is necessary for the existence of other things like fire, and of course, including we can say including water, and can be found in water and in the earth. So air is found in the other substances. So it can support itself and other heavier bodies like the heavenly bodies. Air sustains life. It is the primary difference between the animate and the inanimate, meaning the living and the non-living. And the soul, according to Anaximenes, can actually be identical with the air. Okay, so here he's trying to say that we have to be able to account to say something about what is this basic element, because when we say apeiron, it's like you remember our discussion on the Tao, it could be like the Tao because the Tao is unnameable. Okay, now Anaximenes account for the process of change by two principles that produce changes in the density of basic substances. Um, these are uh, rarefaction, rarefaction or expansion, and condensation or compression. So expansion, compression. This account for the change that the process of change that we find in substances. So, for example, extremely expanded air becomes warm and eventually it becomes fire. And an extremely compressed air becomes cold. And consequently, the changes of this will lead into wind, air, earth, and stone. So he proved this and provided the first recorded experiment to provide evidence for his claim. So he observed that when the mouth, or when our mouth, is wide open, the breath that comes out of it is warm. Okay? But when the mouth is almost closed, the breath that comes out of our mouth is cold. Okay? All right. I think I have to repeat that. He observed that when the mouth is wide open, the breath that comes out is warm, but when the mouth is almost closed, the breath that comes out of it is cold. So that is a basic experiment to provide evidence for his claim. So Anaximenes' significance lies in his effort to temper abstract thought with conceptual clarification. That we have to be clear with our ideas, that we must be able to explain, and we must be able to demonstrate our claims through some form of experimentation. He also treated the problems of change more explicitly and adequately, instead of just saying that, well, all things contain uh, some kind of a principle of change. So he tried to provide an answer that has some degree of scientific basis. So these are the important Milesian or Ionian philosophers. Now, in summary, the Milesians or the Ionians illustrated the emergence of epistemological orientations and methodological concerns. Thales and Anaximenes' positions could be viewed as primitive empiricism because they started from sense experience, while Anaximander's position could be regarded as a crude form of rationalism because he postulated the boundless on the basis of rational argument. However, they shared some commonalities because they introduced the problem of appearance as against reality, what appears in experience as appears to what really is the ultimate reality. And they all agreed on how the world appears to be, but what they wanted to know was the ultimate reality, the basic principle underlying the multiplicity of the physical world. Now, despite their differences as far as the answer to the fundamental question, they all assumed that they could explain everything in the universe without exception on the basis of a single principle, namely for Thales, water, or apeiron, or air. And lastly, they all assumed that monistic principle was a physical substance or some sort of a physical substance. Well, although subsequent philosophers would dismiss their assumptions, they were the first to reduce the multiplicity of nature into simpler unity. And for that, we have to be more appreciative of these Milesians or Ionian philosophers because they have initiated this philosophical speculation or this philosophical enterprise about reality. Okay, now let's move on to the next philosopher, uh, Pythagoras. And of course, Pythagoras figured very prominently in the history of philosophy because we actually attribute to him the term or the combination of the term philosophia, Pythagoras. Okay, so what's Pythagoras' conception of reality? Pythagoras thought that there was an order or unity in the cosmos, and that it was this nature or this principle or this reality is mathematical in nature. Pythagoras believed that numbers lie at the base of reality and that numbers have their own reality. The numbers have their reality of their own. So according to him, mathematical points produce lines, and the conjunction of lines produce planes, and the multitude of planes produce solids. Even music provides clues to the mathematical nature of the universe. So the Pythagoreans discover that the differences between musical tones are functions of exact numerical ratios. Remember, that if you're familiar with the time signature, okay, the staff, okay? And if numbers are the basis of music, then it is also possible that they are also the basis of everything. So based on their crude measurement, the distance between the planets were in the same proportion as the notes in a musical scale. And they call this the harmony of the spheres. The harmony of the spheres. Now, Pythagoras and his philosophers saw the universe as governed by a continual conflict between order and disorder, stability and strife, which they summarize in the table of opposites. Okay, so this table opposites, this table actually is a table of the pairs of the of the opposite. Like for example, on one side there is order, and then its opposite is disorder. Then there is limit or finitude and unlimited or infinity. There is odd, there is on the opposite side even. One and the opposite is many. Right, the opposite is left. Male, the opposite is female. Rest, the opposite is motion. Straight, the opposite is crooked. Good, the opposite, of course, is evil. And of course, light, the opposite is darkness. So, this table, according to the Pythagoreans, represents the two forces in the universe. And therefore, such type of metaphysics, this kind of metaphysics that the Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans presented, is a kind of dualism. Okay? Dualism. All right. Now, let's move to the next philosopher, uh, Heraclitus. Okay? So, Heraclitus, for him, wisdom is the goal of philosophy. You need to attain wisdom. However, we cannot obtain wisdom by only acquiring factual information. What is needed is knowledge of the hidden meaning behind the appearances, okay, or behind the factual information. So we need to investigate what is the underlying principle behind the appearances. The world, he said, comes to us in the form of a riddle. He said reality loves to conceal itself. The secret to reality is found by understanding the logos, because we know what the logos is. Logos would be let's say, the structure, the logical structure, the principle behind reality. So, for the Greeks, the term logos could mean, well, one, a statement or a discourse or reason or the rational content of what is spoken. But logos does not only suggest what is in the mind, it could also mean the rational order or structure of the universe itself. So logos is not just, something that is in the human mind. Like, for example, you understand something and therefore you can make a discourse out of it, you can say something of it, you can conceive uh, an idea about it. But logos also refers to the rational, logical order of the universe. So there is logos inside our mind. At the same time, there's also logos with outside. Okay, there is our mind has a logical structure, but at the same time, uh, there is also a logical structure of the external reality. So Heraclitus considered reality as change, which is the more uh, common or the more well-known idea of Heraclitus. He asserted that change is ultimate and that most of our experiences of stability and permanence are merely how things appear to us. So if we see stability and permanence in reality, for him, it is just an appearance. Behind the appearance of stability is the reality of change. All objects that we talk or think about in reality is they are just collection of processes, continuous processes, some kind of a flux. So again, Heraclitus used the metaphor of a river to drive his point. And this is the very famous quotation from Heraclitus. One cannot step into the same river twice because the stream of the water is constantly moving, that when you step on it, the second time you step on it, it will no longer be the same water or the same stream anymore. So, because everything is in a constant flux. So, while the name may remain the same for a river or any object for that matter, the waters of the river are constantly changing because it is a stream. So we are no longer stepping on the same or river, or we are no longer dealing or talking about the same physical identity when we talk of different objects because it must have already changed. So we step and do not step into the same river uh, again. So meaning when we step onto it, into it again, it will not be the same river. Okay. So again, he said the sun is new every day. Well, we may see the same sun in the following morning or in the succeeding days, but it's no longer the same sun that we saw yesterday. Okay. So everything like the river, the sun is constantly changing and never staying the same. So Heraclitus put forward his thesis of the unity of opposites. Different aspects of the same thing can have opposite characteristics. While a pen, for example, moves in a straight line across a page when we write a sentence, it moves in crooked lines as if it forms different letters. So it may be moving in a straight line, but in order for the pen to draw a straight, or to write a sentence, it must actually move in crooked lines in order to form the letters that comprise the sentence. So there is the crooked and there is the straight, the unity of the opposites. Right. So while other philosophers would say it's the warring opposite, Heraclitus talks of the unity of opposites, quite similar to the unity of opposites that the Chinese philosophers talk about the unity of the relative opposites. Okay? Like, for example, in the case of the yin yang. So, some opposites are merely different stages in one continuous process. Hence, for example, night and day are one because it's just different stages of one continuous process. Uh, Hot and cold are relative properties that coexist in the same continuum. And he also showed that conflict between opposites could produce something good. So, for example, the tension that exists between the bow and the lyre, show the harmony in conflict. So the illusion of stability of the strings results actually from the balance opposition of forces. So there may be stability, but behind that is the balance opposition of forces. So what account for the appearance of stability is actually the balance opposition of forces. Heraclitus also said that the fundamental reality is an everlasting fire. He said, this world order, the same for all, none of the gods nor of men has made. But it was always and is and shall be an ever living fire, which being kindled in measure and extinguished in measure. So, of course, it's possible that he was referring to uh, fire figuratively, but nevertheless, when you look at the fire, the flame, for example, the flame or the fire, it is a process rather than a substantial object. It is constantly changing the the, the flames, constantly changing, but at the same time, it remains the same. See, imagine the flame constantly changing in colors, right? Changing in appearance, but the fire remains the same. It transforms everything that it touches. Okay? and it's part of the, it becomes the cause of a lot of transformation of changes. Okay, so through these change, although these things change, there is a balance to nature and the total amount of reality that remains the same. So, like Pythagoras, Heraclitus sought for the unity of reality not in a material substance but in a formal pattern. And he developed further the notion that universal rationality pervades in the universe, which our finite mind is capable of understanding. Okay? So that's Heraclitus. Now let's move on to the next philosopher, and this next philosopher is actually the counterpart of Heraclitus, and that's Parmenides. Okay, so Parmenides' starting point is the essence of simplicity. His basic position can be stated into this proposition: whatever exists exists, and there is nothing apart from that which exists. We can uh, we can translate, or we can formulate Parmenides' arguments into this: anything we can think or speak about either exists or does not exist. Anything that does not exist is nothing. We cannot think or speak about nothing. So, we cannot think or speak about what does not exist. Therefore, anything we can think or speak about exists. Okay? So, whatever exists exists, and there's nothing apart from that which exists. So, if it's a very simple argument, because anything that we can speak of, anything that we can speak about exists, because it's impossible for us to think or speak of something that does not exist at all. So if I can say water, if anything that I say, actually, practically, anything that we can think of must exist, must have some form of existence. So the first statement, anything we can think of about, we can think or speak about either exists or does not exist, presents two mutually exclusive alternatives, because something cannot exist and not exist at the same time, right? Now, number two, and number two statement in the argument is, uh, anything that does not exist is nothing. Anything that does not exist is nothing. That is true by definition, right? And number three statement says, so we cannot think or speak about what does not exist. Number three, for Parmenides, uh, though an object, to think means uh, to think about something. Thought is an object. To think means uh, to think is always to think about something. All right. So you cannot say, "What are you thinking?" Nothing. Well, it's impossible, because when you are thinking, it always has an object. You always talk about something, unless, of course, nothing is a kind of a word. Then you can say, well, what are you thinking? I'm thinking of the term nothing. Since you can think of the term nothing, then it exists, right? So, a thought without content, according to Parmenides, is not thought at all. It's impossible to think, and then there's no content of our thought. Okay? So even if, as I've said, even if you are saying, he's thinking nothing, nothing becomes the object of his thought, and therefore nothing exists, unless you're talking of real of nothing, which is actually there's no such thing, in fact. Okay, so number four, which is actually the conclusion, it may seem possible to think of things that do not exist. Like, for example, square circle or the son of a barren woman. But for Parmenides, it one does not mean that one is thinking about something that does not exist. A square and a circle definitely exist, and a son and a barren woman definitely exist. But the combination of these concepts or objects are inaccurate. Therefore, to think about nothing is simply to think or speak nonsense. Okay? So, a square circle, son of a barren woman. Well, is it really nothing? No, it's not really nothing because a square exists and circle exists. So the statement still talks about something that exists. Okay? So Parmenides' position is a rigorous kind of rationalism which claims that anything that can be the object of our thought is identical with what exists, and anything that we cannot think of or cannot be thought cannot exist. Uh, it's very difficult to really escape this Parmenidean argument because uh, it's a well crafted argument, really. Okay, so for Parmenides, the fundamental reality of being can be spoken of as the what is or the one. Okay, so reality is, what exists. And from this initial argument, he would draw several logical consequences. First, uh, being is uncreated. Being is uncreated. So if being started or was at some point created, it could either have to come from something or just came into being from nothing. But if being is all there is, then it could not come from something. Because if being is there, then it has been there ever since. Okay? It is uncreated. And even if we talk of a particular thing being created of something, then that something is also being. It must that something must have been there ever since. Okay? So if being is all there is, then it could not come from something. Uh, neither could it be neither could it come from nothing because then that does not exist cannot be the cause of something. How could something that does not exist could be the cause of anything at all? So with this, he said being is uncreated because being has always been there. Okay. Now the second is that being is unchangeable and imperishable. If it could change, what could it change into? What could a being change into? It could not change into being since it is already being. Okay? It cannot change or be destroyed, for it would become nothing. But as Parmenides has already shown, non-being or nothing cannot exist or be thought. So, being cannot change and it cannot perish. Okay? So, uh, then number three, being is one and indivisible. What could divide being or mark the division of being? Being? Then being would just be divided by itself. And therefore, it is not a division itself. A pool of water cannot be divided by water because it would be the same water. Number four, being is motionless. Now, motion requires an empty space. Because when something moves, then it will occupy an empty space. But that is an impossible because an empty space is nothing and it does not exist. Therefore, how can there be motion of being? Number five, being is a finite body. Parmenides assumed the material monism of the Ionians and the Milesians here when he conceived of being as a physical body. Being is homogeneous and evenly distributed throughout the universe. So when you say being is a finite body, he actually meant that being is immense. It is scattered all over the universe, all over the cosmos. Okay, so that's the Parmenidean argument uh, of being. Okay? One of the classic really argument in Greek philosophy. And once you enter into the the basic premises of Parmenides, it's impossible really to come up with a different conclusion than the conclusion that he had drawn from this argument. Now let's go to the next philosopher, Empedocles. And Empedocles is a pluralist, although he agreed with Parmenides that there can be no absolute creation or destruction of reality or of being. Empedocles claimed that there is relative change. He postulated both change and permanence. So here he's trying to sort of uh, integrate, find a middle position between the position of Heraclitus and the position of Parmenides. So to achieve a kind of compromise between the position of change of Heraclitus and the notion of being of Parmenides. He claimed, however, that there are four permanent things in the cosmos. And these are actually the fundamental elements: earth, air, fire, and water. These are the fundamental and eternal substances or elements. And change is explained as the combination and separation of all these basic elements. However, a simple combination or separation of these elements is not sufficient to explain the world of experience. Therefore, Empedocles formulated a set of principles of the unification that explains how the individual elements, the earth, water, fire, etc., are combined into certain unified objects like stone, trees, etc. So the things, the elements, or the objects that we see in reality are now combination of these basic elements. And he tried to provide the principle of this unification. So even the universe is one big unified object composed of smaller objects. So that's the first principle of unification. That the composite, the complex realities or objects that they find in reality is actually a combination of smaller objects. The second principle is the principle of individuation, which explains how unities, even the smaller ones, disintegrate and break down into their separate components. So this will be there will be the basic elements, the basic components of composite objects. So Empedocles claimed that both principles, the principle of the unification and individuation, are essential to explain the change in the universe. So he further explained that the principle of unity or unification is attraction. So smaller objects are attracted to one another, and therefore they form a much bigger or compound or composite objects. And the other principle is the principle of disintegration is strife. So the individuation, that principle is strife. Okay, so when they disintegrate because of strife or tension, The interaction of these two opposing forces results in the continual amount of flux in the universe. So that's how Empedocles explained the permanence and the flux or change in reality. Now, next philosopher is Democritus. Democritus is a member of the atomist school, atomism. So, Democritus explains reality based on two principles: the atoms and the void. Atoms and void. By postulating the void or the empty space, the atomists agreed with Parmenides because they claim that what is does exist, and what does not exist is actually nothing. Okay, so here they follow this Parmenidean principle. Now, as to the atoms have several features. First, that they are indivisible, they are eternal, and they are unchanging. However, they are infinite in numbers, which only in unlimited space, can allow. So, infinite number, indivisible, eternal, unchanging. And pretty much like the monads. In fact, the monads of Leibniz very similar to the concept of the atoms of Democritus. Although the atom is something physical, but the monads is something that is, substantial or spiritual. Number two, there are quantitative differences between the atoms. So the atoms come in different sizes, they come in different shapes. Number three, that they are qualitatively alike or neutral, meaning they do not have color, they do not have taste, they do not have temperature or odor. So those are the properties of the atoms for uh, Democritus. Change was understood as a result of the differing relationships of the atoms. And Democritus explains some features of the change. Number one, that motion is directionless because there is no up or down in any absolute sense. So, there is no reference in the first place. Number two, atoms do not have weight in any absolute sense. As we know it now, weight is a relative property, and space travel illustrates this. Okay? And number three, that the motion of atoms is eternal because there is no natural final resting place for the atoms. So it will continually move. There's no final destinations sort of for the atoms. So those are the features of change according to Democritus. Now, the world that we experience can be explained in terms of the previous principles. The motion of atoms and their geometrical properties produce various interactions and combinations that in turn produce all the qualities that we experience through our senses. So, well, those are the pre-Socratic philosophers, and I hope you have learned something from this. It's rather difficult, to explain in details all this given the limited time, but hopefully you have understood something from this discussion about the pre-Socratic philosophers. So thank you very much for listening.